My name is Tom. Let's talk about the need to abolish the death penalty in the United States. When innocent lives are condemned to death, the process by which the situation arises must be flawed. In 1994, an intellectually handicapped man was sentenced to death by the governor of Virginia. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole because he gave a confession to the police that they felt deserved this sentence. His name was Earl Washington, and he was described by many as an easily persuaded, childlike special education dropout. His confession, though, was full of inconsistencies. See, at one point in the confession, he claimed that the victim was white, and at another point in the confession, he claimed that he was black. Earl spent 6 years on death row until finally DNA evidence came up that exonerated him and proved his innocence. He was fortunate because in this case, they had that evidence, but in many cases, evidence like this never comes up. As citizens of the U.S., we have the opportunity to decide what courses of action are acceptable with regard to the punishment of different criminal acts. But it's not like anyone can be prosecuted and sentenced to death, is it? Here's the thing, the prosecution system is flawed big time. And one of the biggest concerns is the arbitrary and unfair use of the death penalty. Sentencing a person to death is a serious thing to do, and so it demands a lot. There is, and very well should be, this high demand for consistency. There was a case where a murder took place in a parking lot that was on the county border of Lexington County and Richland County, South Carolina. In Lexington County, there had been 12 people ever to be given the death penalty, while in Richland, only one has ever been given the death penalty. The murder was determined to have happened in Lexington County's border, and so the suspect was given the death penalty. However, if the murder had just happened a few feet over in the other jurisdiction, the death penalty would have almost certainly not have been imposed. This was merely because one jurisdiction, capital punishment, is almost always pursued, and the other, it rarely is pursued. It's arbitrary. It's not a matter of the heinousness of the crime. It's a matter of where the crime took place. It's often also a matter of whether or not the perpetrator is white or black, or if the victim is white or black, or how skilled the defense lawyer is. Is the individual in custody even guilty? See, every case open to be pursued with a death sentence is subject to so many inconsistent variables that the possibility for arbitrary prosecution should not be ignored. Second concern is racial bias. An important note here, prosecutors have complete discretion to decide whether or not to pursue the death penalty. This without a doubt contributes to racial disparities in regard to the infliction of the death penalty. Even though African Americans are a minority in the U.S., they are victims of half the murders committed here. But somehow, 80% of the African Americans on death row were there because of crimes against white people. It's been shown in study after study, that people of color tend to be treated more harshly than white people within law. People who aren't white tend to get stopped by the police, arrested, denied bail, to be charged with a more serious crime when a less serious crime could have been charged. They're more likely to be convicted, and they're more likely to get a worse sentence than white people tend to get. The only thing people of color are less likely to get is a position in the justice system as judge, juror, prosecutor, or lawyer. In the 38 states that have the death penalty, 97% of them, 97% of the chief prosecutors there are white. The third problem is poor representation. The U.S. Supreme Court Justice Ruth Ginsburg claimed to observe something interesting back in 2001. She said that she has yet to see a death case in the Supreme Court in which the defendant was well represented at the trial. She said that well-represented people don't get the death penalty. And there's a reason. There's a reason for this. It's incompetency on part of the prosecutor. There have been several states where after investigation, anywhere from a fourth to a third of those given the death penalty were represented by lawyers who were later disbarred, suspended, or even committed crimes. See, not to mention, the financial reward for a defense attorney is less than that of a paralegal who works on federal bankruptcy cases. A person who might be given the death penalty usually can't afford a great lawyer, and so it's at the mercy to the overworked and underpaid court-appointed lawyer. Oh, but Tom, you're neglecting all the reasons we have the death penalty in the first place. Am I? Or are they just not adequate justifications? A lot of people claim it's a deterrent to crime. That's wrong. Think about it for a second with a cinematic example. Consider the plot of Law-Abiding Citizen with Gerard Butler. The main character in this film is forced to watch the rape and murder of his wife and young daughter, and then the perpetrator gets away with it with the help of a flawed justice system. The main character methodically plots out his revenge against not only the free perpetrator, but also all those who had a hand in the flawed system. His revenge involves heinous crime after heinous crime, and they are all the result of passion blocking reason. For the main character, the cost of his own life holds very little, if any, when weighed against the deaths of those who wronged him and his family. Now, not every real-life case is like this, but more times than not, the fundamental concern is that those committing heinous crimes hold their own life with little or no weight, and so are not deterred by the promise of capital punishment. There have also been many comprehensive studies that actually show that in the U.S., in states that do not have the death penalty, there have been consistently lower homicide rates for the past 2 decades. Another defense for the death penalty, another common one, is that it's a more economically efficient way to deal with criminals. This is also wrong, since in every state with a capital punishment system, the cost is significantly more expensive than a system where the maximum penalty is life imprisonment. In Texas, for example, it costs about $2.3 million for each case that involves capital punishment. That's around 3 times the cost of keeping someone in a cell with the highest security for 40 years. California spends so much on capital cases that it's almost 10 times the amount it costs to keep someone in prison for life. Many argue then that it's at the very least retributive justice, and so we should still have it around. This is an interesting argument, I'll admit it, but intuitively, retribution is not so much about vengeance as it is deserved. Take this hypothetical. Say there exists some society where every person is designated a spaceship and there are no extra ships. Say the society plans on shooting off in their individual ships into space tomorrow, and each ship has exactly enough resources for the individual which it is designated to. Let's say Jimmy throws a little party in one of the ships, and as a result, one ship is relatively unfit for launch. Now, when tomorrow comes, designating the unfit ship to Jimmy seems like the course of action that aligns with our intuitions. If anyone is to get the defective ship, then Jimmy deserves to. Jimmy is culpable for his actions. See, I think the problem with the death penalty is that it's something that's so natural for us to want, but it's not necessarily something we should have. Look, the death penalty or capital punishment is a government-sanctioned execution. It's used to punish the perpetrators of heinous crimes. Conventionally, heinous crimes refers to homicide, and as many people believe, it's just to make sure the punishment for a criminal fits the crime he or she committed. Recently, however, heinous crimes has come to also involve things like treason, espionage, terrorism, large-scale drug trafficking, in certain cases, even attempted homicide. With the scope of heinous crimes widened like this, a larger variety of criminals can be prosecuted and sentenced to death, which makes discussions about the death penalty all the more serious, as the line between punishments that fit the crime and those that do not becomes fuzzier and fuzzier. See, my focus is not on which crimes fit the punishment of death, rather whether or not the U.S. should be using death as a punishment for any crime. I argue that there are no reasons that adequately justify the use of the death penalty in the United States. And if there are no reasons that adequately justify the use of the death penalty in the United States, then the United States should not use the death penalty. The government should not be responsible for carrying out executions. Taking lives is not something the government should be asked to do or expected to do. The rectifiable or impermanent punishment of criminals is something we're okay with allowing the government to do now and then. But this entire issue is riddled with problem areas. So in conclusion, innocent lives could be executed, and that would indirectly be our fault as citizens for allowing it to be a possibility in the first place. 2, the system is flawed. There's arbitrary use, racial bias, and poor representation. There's Also, no sound defense, no logically sound defense for the death penalty here. Lastly, the best solution that we have is to abolish capital punishment in the United States.